Welcome back to Connection Point Studies. We're glad to have you along in this journey as we cover this series called The Buried Life. We've been having a lot of fun. Hopefully you had an intro video that kind of tells you some of the cool things we're doing on Sundays and that you're joining for this study with us. Now, we've got a warm-up question that'll get you going. Hopefully a lot of you are in brand new groups and you're just getting to know each other. How do we want them to engage in this, Ron? How long do we want them to take in this process?
You know, it's the most important thing about a connection group is to get to know the people you're connecting with. And so these little questions, take your time, 10, 15 minutes, it's totally fine.
Okay, before we get to the question, you always have a good quote.
Yeah,
you put this in your notes. Tell the quote today.
Elbert Hubbard said, freedom cannot be bestowed, it must be achieved.
Okay, you can think about that quote, but now, as a group, what we want you to do actually is if you were free to do anything, what would it be? In other words, most of us are not free to do anything. We have family, we have work, we have all this. But if you had no restraints in your life and you were free to do anything, what is it that you would do? You got to share with the group. I can't wait. I wish I was there to hear some of the things. And share with that group. And then before they come back, what do we want them to do?
We want you to look at Romans 6, 15 through 23. Make some general observations about the passage. Resist the temptation to interpret it now. Just kind of make some observations. I have a couple questions you might think about there.
Okay, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, welcome back. Boy, I wish I could have heard some of their answers.
Yeah.
Well, what if you had no restraints, would you do?
I would preach.
Would you?
I would totally. Yeah.
You know, I could see that. You enjoy that, and you do that from time to time for me and for others. Way to go. Okay, that's cool.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to know what they would do. Really, in this whole passage, I want to tell you, the way I look at this whole passage is all about freeing us to do what we're designed to do. That's what I think this whole Buried Life series is about, is freeing us. Now, and this passage in particular, hopefully you've read it and looked at it and made some observations. So let's make some observations with them. What things stick out to you?
Well, Paul asked this question that is pretty interesting. He says, shall we sin because we're not under law but under grace? It's really almost a parallel of the question he asked at the beginning of chapter 6.
Another question, huh?
Yeah. And you see, like when I look at a passage, I want to see what patterns or concepts he's using, and he uses over and over again, slave free, slave free. So I see that popping out. Yeah,
that's a powerful image. And they had Hebrew slavery, which was that you could hire a person for 6 years, and then they were set free, and they could also attach themselves to somebody. So there were all kinds of Roman slavery going on at that time, all kinds of image of slavery, which they would have fully understood. Probably more than we do.
Well, about a third of all people in the Roman Empire were slaves.
It was a huge amount.
Yeah, almost everybody, knew somebody who was a slave or might have been a slave themselves.
Right. Okay, so these are the images that come out over and over again. So let's begin to focus and go through each question. Give them a question as we focus a little.
Yeah, so there was two parallel questions that Paul asked about, shall we continue in sin so that grace may increase? That was in verse 1. And then, shall we go on sinning, now that we're free from the law in verse 15? So they're almost the same, but they're a little bit different. So I want you to think about how they're different.
Right. That's a good question for you to think about, and we'll come back and talk about it. All right, Ron, come on. Those are the same questions. Aren't they the same?
If you read Greek, you would know they're not the same.
Okay, well, maybe these folks don't know Greek here. So how are they different?
Well, okay, so in Romans 6:1, he uses this phrase that's translated, continue in sin.
Right.
It implies continuing this life that's separated from God.
Right.
And then in verse 15, he uses a different Greek word or phrase. He uses hamartia, which is an act of sin. So he's now talking about this life pattern, but specific acts. So shall we continue doing sins so that grace might increase?
So now he's really getting specific and saying, hey, you need to deal with this stuff that you know is wrong in your life.
Right, yeah.
So that helps us understand the difference. Now let's dig a little bit deeper and give him another question here as we go on.
So Paul just asked a question. I want to know, how does he answer it? Because that's where we get into it. Yeah.
same deal. How does he answer it? Like he did the first study, he answered that question. Now we're going to answer it again.
Right.
Look at that, and we'll come back and talk about it. All right, so Ron, it's obvious that Paul answers this question. How comment on how you see he answered it?
Well, basically, I think Paul's saying you're slaves to the one you obey. And so, in other words, what you do reveals who is effectively your master.
Okay.
Now, you might be a Christian in that you've been forgiven, but if you're obeying slaves or sinning, you're acting like a slave to sin.
So you're still under its power, and you didn't used to. It's like,
right.
Well, we'll not even think of a question. So let's dig a little bit deeper and go to the next question.
Okay. So then Paul kind of digresses a little bit, and he thanks God for something. So what is it that Paul is thanking God for?
Interesting. He makes a change of gears here. So take a minute, look at that in the next verses. All right, so Paul's thanking God. What is he thanking God for, Ron?
Well, he says, I thank God that you used to be these slaves of sins, but when you start obeying, you become a slave to righteousness.
Yeah, you're attaching yourself to Christ, which is pretty powerful.
Right.
And I've seen that in my life.
Yeah.
Have you, Ron? And I think people in the groups have seen this. When you really connect to God, I don't even know that you understand completely how it happens, but it seems like God just naturally changes us. And it's not about what we can't do. It's about what we can do with God's help, I think.
Yeah. And in fact, don't get too confused and think, well, that means that you never sin again. Because he's not saying that, but it's a general principle. The general direction of your life is moving towards righteousness.
Right on. Okay, so as we look at the next question, he begins using a human analogy, right? And he looks at this human analogy. So take a look at that, and we've got some questions for you to answer there. So take a look and answer that question in Romans 6:19, and we'll come back to you. Okay, so we have this contrast here, right? We have this offering and all of this. Let's explain this a little bit better.
Yeah, so what he's saying is, if you offer yourselves to sin, which is just a way of saying, if I just say, hey, look, I want to sin, I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
And you do whatever it is.
You just give in all the time.
You just do it.
Trying, yeah.
Right. He says what this will result in is moral impurity and increasing lawlessness. It's not a great thing, right? And ultimately, shame and death.
Well, yeah, it's killing you. And it's really true. Sin kills you, right? When you start going down a wrong path, it always ends in death. I mean, it always kills you.
Well, in fact, the picture, remember we said death to Paul, death is separation. And I get this picture of increasing separation. And you can feel it. As a believer, you feel the distance.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if you offer yourselves to God, then you get closer and closer. It's a process called sanctification.
Yeah, it's a great picture. So, Ron, let's give them another question again.
Yeah.
The question is for 6:19 through 23, and we want them to focus on that.
Yeah, so Paul is comparing the results of a life of slavery to sin and slavery to God. So how does he compare and contrast these two? That's what I want you to think about.
Okay, and we'll come back and talk about it. Okay, so Ron, why do you think he uses a human analogy here? He changes gears.
Yeah, in some translations he says, well, it's because of the weakness of your flesh, which is just a fancy way of saying, as new believers, you might not understand this. So he's trying to give you a picture you will understand. Those people understood slavery. So he's saying, I know you get slavery, so I'm going to explain this in terms of slavery. It's not a perfect analogy because if you were enslaved, it's something generally not a good thing, right? And
no,
so,
it's not.
and God doesn't go and enslave people,
Yeah.
but He's saying, like, in terms of obedience,
Yeah.
that's the picture.
Yeah, so that it's a wonderful picture. So let's focus a little bit further. 6:19 tells us something to do. And what is it that it tells us to do? And we want you to answer that question. We'll come back. Okay, Ron, he says that he wants us to offer our weak humanity, really it's our body, right? Our physical body as slaves to right living or righteousness. Righteousness is a tough word. It's just kind of like living right, right?
Right. It's a life that is in a right relationship with God. And so if you're in that right relationship, it's not just something you think or something that's on the inside, but it results in action. So when he says, offer the members of your body, your hands, your feet, your mouth, the things that make up the actions of your life should be offered to God. He says, stop offering them to sin and start offering them to God.
I think this is all about the connectedness we have to Christ. The more we connect to Christ, and we do that through baptism, and the more he helps us just live our lives out. It's wonderful. Sure. Well, we want you to now focus on the very last question, which 6:19 tells us something to do, and it's what we want to end with. And so you think about 6:19, and it tells us specifically something to do. What is it? All right, Ron, so the last thing it tells us to do, and this is kind of what we're wrapping up with.
I always love to end with the action, something you ought to do.
We got to do this, right?
Yeah, and so in the New Living Translation, it says, you must give yourselves to be slaves to righteous
that's
living.
A good thought.
Yeah, so it's give or offer. Take your body, your actions, your mouth, your money, your whole life and offer it to God.
I like that. It's a positive thing. It's not about a whole bunch of things you're not supposed to do. It's about putting your energy toward positive and good things and heading toward God and connecting that way.
Yeah.
What a great way to end. And you can think about that as a group, how you can give yourself to the positive things that God wants you to do. And take a little bit of time, pray around together as a group and share some things in your life. This is a good time for you to really be honest and pray together. And we'll see you next week at Connection Point Studies.